We continue part 4 with chapter 2, which is chapter 18 of the book. The Sabbath question again. He departed for Galilee. It seems to have been the Sabbath after that on which he had healed the man at the Bethesda pool, when passing through a field of ripe barley. Accompanied by his disciples, they began to pluck the ears of the grain and eat them to satisfy their hunger. And this is being bounced off Matthew 12, Mark 2, Luke 6. We say barley as wheat does not ripen in Galilee until a month later, this passage having occurred probably in April. And certain hotter climates would have different times for crops, right? The Sanhedrin at Jerusalem had entered upon a rigorous persecution of Jesus. He was to have no more peace. Detectives dodged his footsteps everywhere. Some of them lurked about this field. And when they saw the disciples eating, they came upon Jesus with the allegation that he and his company were violating the Sabbath. They could not accuse them of stealing, for the law, as stated in Deuteronomy 23:25, allowed a hungry man, when passing through his neighbor's field, to pluck what grain would appease his craving, while it forbade putting the sickle in. They did not care to make an issue on such a charge. The traditional Sabbath was the chosen ground of conflict. According to its enactments, a man might be stoned for plucking grain if he did it to desecrate the Sabbath, and not to remove hunger, such as plucking was a species of threshing. Jesus defended his disciples. They had done no wrong. He retorts upon their accusers, charging them with ignorance or willful neglect of the Scriptures. He referred them to that model of piety. David, what he did in an emergency, how he took the shewbread, which stood in the temple as the sign of Jehovah's communication with the priests, which bread was given him by a distinguished priest and was shared by David with his followers. Here was not a question of tradition, but a distinct violation of a divinely ordered ceremonial, between whose observance and the preservation of life, such men as Abiathar the priest and David, God's elect, did not long hesitate. Compare 1 Samuel 21 and 22, 20 to 23, 2 Samuel 8:17, 1 Chronicles 15:11. In the first of these references, Ahimelech is mentioned as the priest who gave the bread, but in Mark 2:26, the occurrence is stated as the days of Abiathar. Both are historically true. Ahimelech was the father, Abiathar the son. The latter became distinguished in the reign of David. It seems from the Old Testament narratives, well, the Old Testaments are rearranging of Tanakh and some leading translations, even in the Septuagint that we have is not the Jewish Septuagint, it's the Catholic one. So there's that. To have been present when the shewbread was given by his father to David. And Athar and Melech instead of Yah and El being the end, I don't know. They could have been Yazidi or Yazidi converts or something. Well, we call them Yazidi now from the Avestan word. Avestan as in 1700 to 2000 BCE, that language. Well, I guess some of it can be newer Avestan, but it's obviously older than people typically, But his enemies might have replied, and probably did reply, that had nothing to do with this case. That Sabbath profanation was the culmination of offense, the Sabbath law being the greatest of the commandments. His reply to that is, in the temple, the priests carrying forward the ceremonials of worship continually violate what all agreed was the distinct law of the Sabbath. As to outward observance, as instead of resting, they were to do temple work in preparing and presenting sacrifices. And even if the animals kind of go along with it very well, you can still work up quite a sweat, right? Numbers 28:8-9. But they were blameless. It was necessary for the maintenance of public worship. The temple was greater than the Sabbath. He then made the remarkable assertion, a greater thing than the temple is here. It would seem to be a reference to himself, and the meaning to be that these disciples were in the discharge of religious duties in following him, and in a much higher sphere than the priests in the temple, so that if these were not in fault, much more than those were not to be blamed. So, the real issue, he was standing against their authority, right? Again, he repeats to them the words of the prophet Hosea. See Hosea 6:6, with which you compare the words in 1 Samuel 15:22. I will have mercy and not sacrifice, teaching them that all God's laws are laid upon the basis of mercy and not pain-giving, and no amount of sacrifice in any shape, whether in offering victims upon the altar or in the afflicting of oneself, is at all acceptable to God, unless the heart be full of love and mercy. And thus, out of their law, and out of their most cherished history, and out of their prophets, he computes them. Now, particularly if you consider the getting old and that sort of stuff, it's probably more long volumes of pain-taking, right? But you don't, you don't wait till the animal's sick and then, so that there can easily be issues with the meat, even if you think it's just some form of animal senility or something. But yeah, it's not about pain giving or self-mortification or something like this. Sometimes the right thing is to go through difficulty, but yeah, that's not the point. It's about your obedience. It's about your sacrifice, not the sacrifice, your sacrifice, right? But he does not rest on that. He lays down the memorable position, which is the key of the whole Sabbatic idea and arrangement. The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Whatever regulation for the observance of the Sabbath may be set up by humans, by human authority, which fails to make it a delight, a profit, a culture, and happy goodness, is wholly invalid and is to be rejected. Man is not to be the slave of the Sabbath. The Sabbath is to be the servant of man. Man is greater than the Sabbath. He rules it. And then Jesus added those other words, which he connects with the former by logical process. Wherefore the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath day. He who is the consummate man, who is essential manhood, who is to exist in the minds of the coming ages as the representative man, he, in virtue of this manness, we're referring to all humans, obviously, is the ruler of the Sabbath day, and he has a right to say what may be done and what may not be done on the Sabbath. It will be seen from this that he made no intimation for the abrogation of the Sabbath, or changing it to a different day. No man abrogates a kingdom by declaring himself king. He reaffirms it. He reestablishes it by removing it from the wretched circumstances of tradition and placing it where God originally intended it, on the rational basis of being the supply for a demand widely created in man. Now it commends itself to the reasons of men. Now we can take the ideas of Jesus and by their light survey the Sabbath. as an institution of divine beneficence. If it be not that, it is a crime. The battle on the Sabbath question continued to be urged by the Pharisees and bravely fought by Jesus. He shrank from none of its issues. He was retiring into Galilee. And this is bounced off Mark 4, Matthew 12, Luke 6. He was retiring into Galilee. On the very next Sabbath, after the scene in the barley field, he entered into a synagogue. It is not certain in what town this particular synagogue was located. Some infer from Mark 3 that it was Capernaum, but there is no authority for this, and the absence of the article in the original slightly favors the opinion that it was some other synagogue. As his custom was, he began to teach the people. When occasion for exhortation was given, the intense hatred of the Pharisaic party and their conspiracy to crush him reappear in still more significant manner. As I pointed out, there's a lot more emphasis on hating people in the Bible, especially in what you call the New Testament, than loving them. It seems to have been arranged that there should be present a man who had an arm that had been withered by a wound or by disease, that they might see whether Jesus would heal on the Sabbath, that they might direct the attention of Jesus to this afflicted man. The scribes and Pharisees asked him, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath day?" According to the strictest teaching of their school, it was not. Shammai, the preceptor of the great Hillel and one of the earliest founders of their sect, distinctly laid down the law: let no one console the sick nor visit the mourning on the Sabbath day. Well, I'm not going to hold that guy as much of an authority in that case, right? Hillel was held in the very highest esteem as the most learned in the laws of the Jews. He was more liberal than his master, Shammai, and the differences of their teaching led their disciples to blows, which resulted in the death of several persons. Hillel is reported by some as the grandfather of that Gamaliel who was preceptor to the Saul of Tarsus. They might therefore accuse Jesus if he healed on the sacred day. Reading their intents, Jesus said to the man with the withered hand, "Stand and rise forth in the midst." And the man arose and took a conspicuous position. St. Jerome, who translated the Gospel according to the Hebrews, an apocryphal book seemingly an adulterated version of St. Matthew, could have been earlier, some of this stuff, and much in use among the Nazarenes and Ebionites, says that this man was a stonemason, and he told his occupation to Jesus, adding that he was compelled to obtain his food by the labor of his hands, and he prayed that Jesus to heal him, that he might no longer basely beg his bread. Now, what if it was never a prayer to Jesus, but a prayer that, oh, here's this healer in my midst. Please, God, let me be the one being healed. Right? Now, even in the churches, we can see that. Not all churches have those healing ceremonies, you could say. And when we're talking about alternative gospels, well, into the 4th century of the Common Era, you still had changes towards the end of it. You still had changes in the Greek, and then that stopped around like 3:8, and you had some changes when it was turned into the Vulgate. So those texts that were written around the time of the the decay and the early Gospels in this, in the first half of the second century. Yes, I know John was written in the 90s. Well, those were all edited and made bigger and a bunch of other changes. So you could say the ones that pretty much stayed the same as they were in the second or third century and didn't go through doctrinal attributes and stuff like that. In a way, they're earlier, right? It is to be noticed that when a man has a real malady and there appears any prospect of relief, how indifferent he becomes to all philosophical theories of the modes of treatment, and how absorbed in the practical matter of fact, in which his personal comfort is most deeply concerned. This was a fine stroke upon the part of Jesus. It held up the sufferer to the gaze of the assembly. It appealed to the humanity of the persecutors and invited the sympathy of the spectators. Jesus then turned upon his pursuers with this movement. They had narrowed the question to the doing or the not doing on the Sabbath. By counter question, he lifted the whole subject to a loftier light. Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath days, or to do evil? To save or destroy? The question was double-edged. On one side it cut the knot of their question, on the other side it smote them. They were filled with hatred. They were pursuing him on the Sabbath day, trying to kill him. He was about works of goodness and giving life and more life, making life joyful that had been almost intolerable. Now, who will be to be blamed? You, who are full of murderous intent, or I, if I heal this sufferer? They were silenced. But he pushed the question home to them. Suppose one of you owned a single sheep, and on the Sabbath it should fall into a cistern. Would he not lay hold upon him and pull him out? A man is much better than a sheep. Wherefore, to do good on the Sabbath is lawful. It appears from this that in the days of Jesus, the putting of a sheep out of the pit on the Sabbath was a thing allowed amongst them, else this ad hominem appeal had no force. Subsequently, it was, in the express terms, forbidden in the Gemara, because Gemara is secondary to the Mishnah, and only permitted to lay planks for the animal to come out. Stiers suggests that this explicit regulation was made because of the words of Jesus, but the puritanic instinct would dominate, holding on to the property while appearing very sanctimonious about the moral law. His enemies were silent. Their hardness towards the sufferer, their hatred towards himself, their spiritual blindness in not seeing the merciful intent of all moral law, aroused mingled feelings in Jesus. He was angry and was sorry. He exhibited in the most surprising manner that which appears in all noble souls, a tenderness for the sinful man while the sin is hated. But turning toward the waiting patient, he said, "Stretch forth thy hand." The man obeyed. He lifted it. It was as whole as the other arm. The cure was instantaneous and complete. It was a display of mighty power and goodness. He flung himself into the hands of his foes to save this unknown sufferer. No selfishness held him. He saw his peril, but he chose to face his fate rather than turn from a work of beneficence standing before him to be done. The Pharisees were filled with rage at this new, bold, defiant disregard of their traditions. If their Sabbath laws could not be set aside, then was their authority at an end. It's one of the things that made the Jews a lot more vulnerable, is that rather than like the Muslims, that they can just travel anywhere and whatever sect they can join each other for services. They're like, they drive each other out of each other's places of worship, and you have this other book. It's like, you have to totally switch over to our prayer book compilation, and yeah, sure, fine. The rabbi gives his sermons, but and the Talmud is pretty big, so there's a lot of opinions in there. keep the commandment, don't keep the commandment. I've seen it myself. The blasphemy of 2 weeks ago, they might overlook. The apparent violation of the Sabbath by his disciples, they might forgive, as it had not been done by him in person. But this distinct avowal that their tradition was of no force was intolerable. They hated him. But what could they do with him? He had not mixed medicines to give the sick. He had made no journeys to hunt up and console sufferers in the simple way of ordinary Jewish duty. He had gone into the synagogue and simply said to a man, "Stretch forth thy hand." It seemed impracticable to make a judicial case on such ground. They were as much puzzled as they were enraged, and so they went out and took counsel with the Herodians, how they might compass the destruction of him whose crime was the healing of a fellow man on the Sabbath day. The Herodians are mentioned several times by the New Testament historians. Well, they were writing a gospel more than a history, and so you see some things lacking when you actually compare Herodotus and Plutarch and Pliny and some of the others. Some of those had some strength to it in terms of looking at the history, but I mean, they did look into, it is apparent they looked into some third generation and some other stuff and, in writing what they thought, but if they were inspired of God, they would have been had a surety of some of the details that the Bible says they didn't. But they were those who were the open and avowed political adherents to the family of the Herods. Well, the plural would be Herodim, in whose interest they were ready to make any combination and use any of the ecclesiastical parties and theological sects that might be in existence from time to time. Well, people talk about this cabal, right? There were 200 Jewish families at some point in the Middle Ages, and they chose who the rabbis were, and they kind of mixed in with some of the Christians, and they remain, whether Judaism is their religion or not, they pretty much remain of the most rich and powerful families on earth. Who is the richest and the most powerful is connected to them and usually chosen from among them. But like 12 over 200, and so the number is changed to 13, and it's changed to like 212 families or something like that total, or something like that. So it's but we're not talking about all the Jews. Whatever. It's this relatively small group, and honestly, if you find a Rockefeller or Rothschild or something, they probably have no connection to the big guy of their family, or anywhere near the big guy of that family line. But I mean, the living person. But they were Jews more influenced by political than by religious considerations. The independent nationality of the Jews was the first and the last consideration with them. They believed that the Herodian family had the talent and the ambition to make head against the Roman power, and were so willing to submit to them, although they were of foreign origin and not strict observers of the Mosaic ritual. If they were lending their influence to a domestic tyranny, they were thus at least saved from a direct heathen domination. Well, they acted like everybody. See, that was one of the problems, acting like they're a foreigner. They must have turned their back on God. It's like, no. On this ground, some of the Pharisees would be of their party, and then there were those who might be called liberal Jews, who had become quite lax in their belief in the dogmas of Judaism and in the observance of its stringent ceremonials. Well, some of its basics, if you're going to have them be liberals, but they favored the Haredim as being the most promising agents of bringing about a combination of the Hebrew faith with the other civilization. On this ground, some of the Sadducees would be of their party. Thus, the leading sects would be found at different times cooperating with the Herodians, and The Herodians, using either of these sects as the occasion might seem to indicate, it could be used for increase of political power. In this particular case, the popularity of Jesus was so great that the Pharisees could not openly attack him. The Herodians might be induced to employ their influence with Herod to have Jesus put out of the way on political grounds. Discovering the formation of the powerful conspiracy against him, Jesus retired with his disciples to the shore of the lake of Gennesaret. Mark 3, Matthew 12 is what we're bouncing some of this off of. Vast crowds followed him, not merely from the neighboring district of Galilee, but also from Judea generally, as well as from the city of Jerusalem, and even from the Idumea on the south, and from Perea beyond the Jordan, and from the coast of Tyre and Sidon of the northwest. It was the fame of his miracles that drew them. Among the Orientals to this day, the name and fame of a prophet or a miracle worker will agitate large sections of a country, and people will abandon their ordinary employments to follow him. Jesus healed their diseased people and restored their insane. All had the benefit of his marvelous power and surprising goodness. When those who had unclean spirits cried out to him, "Thou art the Son of God," and, this is proof that Jesus didn't like it, because this person thinks I'm the Son of God. You have to exorcise that person. Addressing him in a language that acknowledged him as the Messiah, he rebuked, well, that's not the same thing, although you look at David and that usage, but anyways, he rebuked them and very strictly charged all who received his favor to abstain from proclaiming him. It would seem to have been his intent to do all the good he could, scattering his blessing with royal bounty, but to do this unobtrusively, so as not to appear to provoke a controversy with his ecclesiastical and political enemies. Also to deter fanaticism, right? Not making it about him, but about the teachings, about the relationship with God. Whenever they provoked it, he never shrank, but he met them promptly, skillfully, and with blows aimed so adroitly and delivered so powerfully that the populace rejoiced in the discomfiture of the rulers. In all other particulars, he so carefully avoided publicity and general popularity that to one of his biographers at least, Mark 3:18, will recall the striking words of Isaiah 42, 1-4. "Behold my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen, in whom my soul delighteth. I have put my spirit upon him. He shall bring forth judgment to the nations. He shall not cry, nor lift up, nor cause his voice to be heard in the street. A bruised reed shall he not break, and the smoking flax shall he not quench." To us at a distance, this reticence with this power might seem marvelous. To those who were in daily and full sight of both, it must have produced a wonderful impression. So great was the crowd that his friends procured for him a small boat which could be used as a kind of movable pulpit, so that from it he could preach to the people on the beach at a distance which should not render his voice inaudible, while it should save him from the pressure of the crowd. There might also have been the additional reason of being able to go quickly from one side of the lake to the other, and thus elude the machinations of his enemies. Now, one of the things that we need to remember is that now there's something like 80 Gospels that weren't included, and versions of some of the a lot, 10,000 variations in the Greek part of the New Testament. Some of them were more authoritative, some were less